People looked at him like he was just another average black kid, a walking target, easy to pick on. They laughed at his skin like it was some kind of joke, whispering insults dressed up as harmless teasing. To them, he was an outsider, someone who didn't belong here. But what they didn't know was this time, they picked the wrong one. Jamal Morrow wasn't some quiet transfer student with a sob story or a scholarship from a charity. He was the son of Louis Morrow, a name people in this city only dared to whisper. A man whose enemies didn't just lose, they disappeared. And now, the bullies at Westwood High were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. That morning, the school, usually buzzing with laughter, the stomp of sneakers down the hall and the slam of lockers, suddenly slowed to a crawl. No one knew why the air felt different, but they felt it. Someone new had walked in, and the whole vibe shifted. Jamal stepped through the school gates, not rushing, not hesitating. His gaze calmly swept across the scene like he was watching a play he already knew by heart. There were no flashy brands on him, no pricey accessories, nothing trying to scream for attention, but somehow his quiet presence made people stop and notice. Jamal didn't walk. He glided through the hallway like a breeze, each step deliberate, measured, not out of place, not afraid. No need to fake a smile or win anyone over. No shield, no smile. Just presence, enough to make people look away the moment their eyes met his. A few students glanced back, whispered, but all looked away the moment Jamal's eyes met theirs. Nobody really knew who he was. And maybe no one had the guts to find out. Jamal's father, Louis Moreau, wasn't a name high school kids would recognize. But the adults? They knew. They knew exactly who he was. And what scared them most was that no one ever said his name out loud, because silence was the only thing that kept you alive. Jamal walked through the long hallway like he was cutting through a tunnel of knives. Whispered remarks brushed past his ears, discrimination wrapped in a neat disguise. Probably just some diversity hire. Looks like he walked straight out of a gang movie. Better watch out if he snaps. But Jamal didn't react, not because he didn't hear it, but because he'd heard it all before. Words like those, no matter how clever, no longer touched him. He had grown up under the weight of stares just like that. Westwood, for all its polish and shine, was just a fancier version of the same old prejudice. This was a playground for the privileged, the sons of CEOs, the daughters of senators. And sitting atop that pyramid was Ryan Carter, captain of the football team, heir to a real estate empire, and a regular guest at the mayor's fundraising dinners. He was born with power, raised on deference, and had never once been told no. To Ryan, the world was split into two kinds of people, the ones who control and the ones who get controlled. And it didn't take him long to decide which one Jamal was. A new kid, black, no clique, no connections, the perfect target to reinforce his dominance. But Ryan had forgotten the most important rule. In a world of predators, the quietest one is often the most dangerous. Ryan Carter had never lost, not once. His life had been smooth as a freshly paved highway, team captain, teacher's favorite, golden boy of a wealthy family with deep ties to the elite. He didn't have to be the best. He just had to look like he was. He didn't need to be strong. People just needed to believe he was. For Ryan, power was never about truth. It was about illusion. And he would crush anyone who dared disturb that illusion. Jamal was perfect prey, a quiet black student with no allies, no backup. But Ryan never struck right away. He preferred the game, the slow play, like a cat toying with a mouse. Test the reaction, push the boundary, then pounce. It started with accidental shoulder bumps in the hallway, just hard enough to throw Jamal off balance, knock some books loose, snickers behind him. Mocking remarks tossed just loud enough for Jamal to catch. Another diversity spot, huh? Hope he's not packing a blade. Guys like that are always one snap away from going off. None of it was new, just a recycled version of the same tired prejudice. But what got under Ryan's skin wasn't that Jamal didn't react. It was how he didn't react. No flinching, no ducking, no awkward smile, no angry comeback. He just kept walking. Calm, silent, like Ryan was nothing but air. And that icy indifference was the hardest hit of all. It made Ryan feel invisible. And that was the one feeling he couldn't stand. Jamal didn't need to puff his chest to prove a point. He didn't live by the rules of those who had to fight for validation. He followed a different code. Real strength doesn't need to roar. His silence wasn't surrender. It was contempt, a quiet declaration, "You're not even worth my words." Ryan started feeling uneasy. He didn't say it out loud, but something flickered inside him for the first time. Doubt. He had always believed he was in control, but now, with one calm stare, one steady step, Jamal made him feel small. Some fight back with fists, some fold. But Jamal, he chose not to play the bully's game. And that was what made Ryan realize the most terrifying thing of all. He might be staring down an opponent he didn't understand at all. Ryan's world had always been a stage, and he was the star at the center. But now, for the first time, someone had stepped into the spotlight and didn't need to perform. No act, no posturing, no need to look dangerous. And the audience, slowly, began to shift their gaze. No one noticed exactly when, but the game had changed. Ryan Carter had never been ignored. In his world, every eye had to be on him. Fear or fury, surrender or defiance. As long as there was a reaction, he won. But Jamal was different. He wasn't scared, wasn't angry, wasn't even bothered. He just walked past Ryan like the guy didn't exist. And that drove Ryan insane. His pride cracked. Ryan couldn't handle being invisible. He'd always thought of himself as a gravitational force, pulling everyone into his orbit with a look, a smirk, a well-timed whisper. But Jamal didn't budge. He walked a straight line like Ryan had no weight at all. That kind of cold calm didn't come from fear. It came from understanding, from someone who knew the rules of the game inside out. And to Ryan, it felt like playing chess against someone who already knew every move he was going to make. That's what made it impossible to let go. He had to get a reaction out of Jamal, no matter what it took. Every morning, the halls of Westwood were packed tight with students, the perfect place for those accidental collisions. Ryan made sure to slam his shoulder hard into Jamal's every time they crossed paths. He was looking for a flicker of anger, a snapped word, anything to prove he'd found a weakness. But nothing. Jamal kept walking, no glance back, no frown, quiet as a tree in a storm. Ryan's crew started whispering, "He's disrespecting you, man. Thinks he's better than us," or something. "Dude doesn't know how things work around here." Ryan didn't need the reminder. He knew he was being challenged, and that only sharpened his resolve. This wasn't teasing anymore. This was war. He had to reclaim what was his: control, status, that silent grip over the school where a single glance could silence a hallway. Then one day, while Jamal was opening his locker, Ryan walked up. No bump this time, no games. He wanted a face-to-face. He wanted to stare Jamal down, hunt for even a flicker of doubt, a tiny crack he could wedge open. "Hey, kid." Ryan's voice was low, steady, thick with meaning. "Pretty sure this place wasn't meant for someone like you." Laughter erupted behind him. His loyal entourage, always ready to hype any scene Ryan put on. A few other students peeked over, then quickly looked away, not wanting to get caught in the crossfire of high school power plays. Jamal closed his locker. No rush, no fear. He turned, eyes meeting Ryan's with that same quiet stare. Not cold, not angry, just empty. A silence so heavy it felt suffocating. The kind of look that made people question themselves. Am I standing in front of someone I should be afraid of? Ryan swallowed hard. That stare didn't speak, but it didn't have to. For the first time, he began to feel something he'd only ever seen in his victims: helplessness. Jamal turned and walked away. No words, no backward glance. And in the awkward laughter trailing behind him, Ryan realized something unsettling. He wasn't the one in control of that encounter. It was a defeat, but it was the first unmistakable signal that his once absolute power was slipping. The moment felt like it should have ended when Jamal left. But what he left behind wasn't a comeback or a punch. It was silence. A crushing stillness that made the air around Ryan feel thick and unsteady. Standing there in the middle of the hallway, Ryan felt something cracking inside him, a fracture he couldn't name. Sure, he'd humiliated Jamal in front of everyone, same way he had done to dozens before, but this time, something was off. Instead of triumph, Ryan felt a cold emptiness opening up beneath his feet, like he'd just lost a game of chess without realizing he'd been checkmated. That feeling, being pierced by someone who hadn't even touched him, made Ryan feel small, powerless, irrelevant. And he hated that. Hated it with everything he had. Not a word, not a blink, just a stare that made Ryan question if he'd just woken something far bigger than himself. Ryan wasn't built for that. He was raised to be seen, to steer the narrative, to rule the school like some crownless king. And when Jamal refused to play by the rules, Ryan felt the ground under his throne begin to tremble. He couldn't let it go on, he told himself that. Jamal could stay icy all he wanted, but eventually he would react. Ryan would force him to crack, whatever it took. Lunchtime. The cafeteria was packed. Ryan stepped in, scanning the room like radar, locking onto a target. It didn't take long to spot Jamal. Same table as always, back left corner by the window. Alone, quiet, eating like the world didn't matter. No sign of tension, no interest in anything going on, not even a flicker of response to Ryan's public provocations over the past few days. And that made Ryan boil. He couldn't let the school keep witnessing this. If people started thinking they could ignore Ryan Carter and walk away untouched, then everything he'd built over the years, his image, his control, would collapse in weeks. This wasn't just about one student anymore. It was about reputation, about dominance, about the illusion of unshakable power that Ryan had always believed would last forever. Some of Ryan's friends had started to feel the shift. They didn't laugh as loudly anymore. A few even glanced at Jamal with a nervousness they couldn't hide. Ryan saw it. And that scared him more than it angered him, because if fear didn't belong to him anymore, then who was he? He didn't wait. He stood up, straightened his collar, took a deep breath and walked toward Jamal. Each step was heavy, deliberate, like thunder rolling in before a storm. And in Ryan's mind, only one thought burned. This time, you're going to look up at me, Morrow, and you're going to learn who really runs this place. Look at that, still sitting alone. Guess no one wants to be friends with the guy. Ryan's words came soft, like a breeze, but sharp as a blade. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to be crass. All he had to do was time it right, strike the tone just so, and the cafeteria seemed to sink into itself. His crew instantly burst out laughing, way louder than they needed to, like trying to send Jamal a message loud and clear. You don't belong here. A few nearby students turned to see what was going on, but just as quickly they looked away, lips pressed tight. At Westwood, there were things you didn't have to say out loud. Like how no one dared interfere with Ryan Carter's business. Like how siding with the weak just made you next in line. Jamal didn't lift his head. He kept eating like the noise around him was nothing more than background static. Every movement was slow, deliberate. No flinch, no shield. Like whatever Ryan was doing wasn't even worth his attention. And that was what pushed Ryan over the edge. This wasn't just indifference. This was a silent slap to the face, a kind of defiance Ryan didn't know how to counter. He was used to pulling strings. A glance could make someone cry. A snide comment could make a crowd go quiet. But this time, nothing. No sign of hurt, no avoidance, no defense. Ryan felt uncertainty creeping in. Like punching a wall and hearing no echo. He needed confirmation, proof that he was still in control. And in that moment, anger and a bruised ego lit a fuse inside him. Without thinking, Ryan lunged forward, grabbed Jamal's tray, and flung it. Everything shattered. The clang of metal hitting wood, food splattering against the tile floor, thick red sauce splashed across Jamal's white shirt like blood smeared on armor. The soda cup tipped, liquid spilling down his sleeve and dripping to the ground. The cafeteria froze. Spoons stopped mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye turned. No one moved, like even a breath might set off the bomb ticking in the room. Jamal sat still. He didn't blink. He slowly placed his fork down and looked at the stain on his shirt like it was something distant, something that had nothing to do with him. He took a breath. Long, steady, like he was listening to the rhythm of his own heart. Then he looked up, locked eyes. No rage, no pain, no trace of fear or humiliation, just a stare, so deep, so still, it pulled the air tight around it. Ryan stood there, hands still on the table like he'd just landed the final blow. But when Jamal's eyes met his, pierced right through him, Ryan felt ice run down his spine. He didn't know why, but his heart sped up, one beat, then two, like his body was screaming, "You just made a mistake." That look, it wasn't from a bullied kid. It was the look of someone who'd already walked through hell and now stood calm because he knew he didn't need to lift a hand. Others would kneel on their own. Ryan forced a smile, tried to stitch together the last of his confidence, but it trembled, and the truth slipped through. Ryan Carter, the one-time ruler of this school, was staring at something he couldn't define and couldn't control. And the fear, though he couldn't name it yet, had already begun to bloom inside his chest. Don't think you're special just 'cause you're different," Ryan snapped, his voice cracking, pulled tight like a wire ready to snap. His crew behind him laughed again, but this time it was strained, hollow. A few students nearby dipped their heads deeper into their lunches, poking at the same slice of cold meat over and over, not daring to look up. No one said a word, but everyone knew what just happened. Jamal still didn't speak. He stood, slowly, no rush, no shame. He didn't brush off the stain, he didn't look around, didn't look back. He simply turned and walked away, as if nothing that just happened was even worth remembering. That silence wasn't surrender. It felt more like a warning. Ryan stood there, watching Jamal's back grow smaller with each step, and suddenly his jaw felt tight. The victorious grin he'd worn just moments ago now hung frozen, mid-air. He'd humiliated Jamal in front of the whole school, hadn't he? He had won, hadn't he? So why did his chest sting? Why did his shoulders feel heavier, like some unseen weight was hanging just behind him? Something inside Ryan was beginning to crack. A feeling he couldn't name, a fear he couldn't see. He couldn't explain it, but it was real. And the harder he tried to convince himself he was still in control, the louder a truth echoed inside him. He had no idea what he was up against, and the game, in truth, had only just begun. That evening, the crystal chandelier above the long dining table cast its usual soft golden light, glinting off crystal glasses and pristine porcelain. The steaks were perfectly seared, the red wine shimmered like garnets, the vegetables laid out with meticulous precision. Everything was perfect, like every dinner in the Morrow household. But tonight, Something felt wrong. A heavy silence blanketed the room, like even the walls were holding their breath. Jamal sat still, fingertips resting lightly on the knife and fork, the plate before him untouched. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because his mind was somewhere else. A cold lunchroom full of noise, a tray flying through the air, sauce splattered across his shirt like blood, and a kid named Ryan Carter thinking he'd just cemented his place on top. Jamal wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt. But one question kept circling his thoughts. How should this be handled? Across the table sat Louis Moreau, his father, a man with hair black streaked with gray, sitting poised in a flawless black suit. Though well past the age most men step out of the spotlight, Louis still carried the kind of presence that made seasoned power players tread lightly. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to speak. Just being in the room made others remember who held the real power. And this was the man who taught Jamal. True power isn't in what you say. It's in what you choose not to say. They ate in silence. No clinking of silverware, no phones at the table, no forced conversation. In Louis Moreau's house, dinner was a ritual, and rituals made no room for weakness. Jamal didn't break the silence because he knew his father never asked questions he didn't already know the answer to. But tonight, without a single word, an unspoken current flowed between them. And when Louis cut the final piece of steak, he set his knife down with the same precision as always, and asked quietly, "What happened at school?" Jamal looked up, his dark brown eyes meeting his father's gaze, sharp, unwavering. There was no concern in that look, no comfort, just the weight of expectation, waiting for a precise answer. Jamal took a breath, shoulders relaxed, no tremble in his voice. Some kids who thought they could push someone around. A long silence followed. Louis didn't respond right away. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully, as if turning every word of Jamal's over in his mind. When he finally set his wineglass down, the soft click of crystal on wood rang like a bell in Jamal's chest. "Which one? His voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy, like a command spoken in a boardroom full of men who knew better than to question it. Jamal waited a few seconds, then shook his head. "I've got it handled." Louis studied his son for a long moment, not to intimidate him, but to measure, to see whether that was a statement of truth or the pride of someone still learning what manhood meant. And then he smiled, not with pride, but with acceptance, a nod given to a young man taking his first step out of the shadow of youth. "All right." He took a small sip of wine and said, slow and steady, "Just remember, some people need to be reminded where they stand." Jamal didn't respond, but something in his eyes shifted. Maybe it was time for Ryan Carter to learn that he was never really in control. Jamal had grown up in the shadow of Louis Moreau, a shadow that didn't smother or suppress, but one that was always there, constant, a reminder that his family wasn't like others. In the underworld, there were names you didn't have to say out loud, because just thinking them made people shiver. Louis was one of those names, a power that never needed to posture but was always respected, always feared. That shadow wasn't a burden. It was a quiet presence that watched. It didn't hold Jamal back, but it followed him with every breath, reminding him that every move he made carried the weight of a name that couldn't afford mistakes. When Louis spoke, no one was surprised. He never asked without purpose. He never said what he hadn't already thought through. His question, "Is there a problem?" wasn't casual concern. It was a command aimed straight at the heart. Jamal looked up, steady brown eyes locking with his father's ice-cold stare. There was no warmth in it, none of the softness other fathers offered, no comforting embrace, no words of encouragement. With Louis, emotions weren't for discussion. They were to be managed. For a brief moment, Jamal hesitated. His fingers tapped lightly along the rim of his plate, like weighing whether to open a door he knew wouldn't close once opened. But then he exhaled and said exactly what he knew would lead to a conversation he couldn't dodge. Just a bunch of punks who think they can push people around. The room sank into a thick silence. Lou didn't react immediately. He kept slicing his steak, chewing slowly as if digesting every word. But his eyes, they never left Jamal. Watching, measuring, absorbing every flicker of expression. Then he placed his knife and fork down. The soft clink echoed like a bell in the stillness. Nahim, he didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, but the word hit the room like a sledgehammer crashing into concrete. In that solemn, gold-lit dining room, it was enough to stop time. Jamal had expected it. He knew Louis didn't tolerate vagueness. In his world, there was no such thing as maybe tomorrow. No offense too small to ignore. Everything had rules, and if someone crossed the family, they paid the price. Not with words, but with a silence more terrifying than any blow. But Jamal didn't want it to go that way. He looked at his father, eyes firm, no fear, no hiding. "I've got it." Another pause. Louis studied his son a while longer. Not to question the words, but to read between them, to see if this was real conviction, or just the posturing of a boy trying too hard to be a man. And then something unexpected. He smiled, just a flicker. Brief, not sweet. But Jamal knew it wasn't mockery, it was recognition. Louis lifted his wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid like he was spinning an old memory between his fingers. One word. But it carried the weight of 100 meanings. Then he added, not a threat, not an order, but like handing down a law written in the family's blood. But remember, some people need to be reminded where they stand. Jamal didn't speak, but something inside him shifted. In that moment, he wasn't just a teenager at the dinner table anymore. He was the heir to a legacy, not by title, but by choice. And the choice he made this time would define who Jamal Morrow truly was, in a way no one saw coming. Louis Morrow didn't smile often, but this time his lips curved slightly, an expression too brief to be called pleased, too restrained to be called proud. It was a smile of acknowledgement, a signal that he'd seen something in Jamal's eyes, something he respected, not ego, not impulse, not anger, but the clarity of knowing who you are, what you'll do, and doing it quietly, with precision. Louis raised his glass again, gently swirling the wine like he was testing the strength of a rare vintage. When he set it down, his voice came low, deep and steady, like the ticking of an ancient clock. The one word, but an entire world inside it. No more questions, no demand for a name, no instructions. And yet, just after, Louis tilted his head, his seasoned eyes never leaving Jamal. Some people need to be reminded where they stand. It wasn't a threat. It was a principle. A torch passed down, a strand of DNA made manifest in a sentence. Jamal stayed silent, but inside thoughts spun like a storm. He understood exactly what his father meant. In Louis Morrow's world, power didn't come from lashing out or getting loud. It came from making someone realize if they took one more step across the line, they wouldn't just get hurt. They'd disappear, without reason, without noise, and Jamal knew he wasn't his father. He didn't live to control others. But there was one thing he swore to himself. No one would ever dictate his fate but him. If Ryan Carter thought he could step on Jamal the same way he'd crushed others, then he'd made a mistake. And worse than a mistake, he'd messed with the wrong blood. The name Jamal Morrow started slipping through the halls of Westwood like a sound wave no one could control. First it was whispers behind backs, then soft murmurs in people's ears. He didn't have to do anything, didn't need to stand out, didn't even need to look at anyone. But that name, it spread on its own, like smoke from a fire still hiding its flames. Ryan Carter first felt the shift in people's eyes. Before, when he walked by, heads lifted, eyes followed respectfully, cautiously, sometimes with that mix of awe and fear. But now? Now when he passed, they didn't look at him, they looked around him, as if scanning the air to see if he was nearby. Jamal Marrow, the name carried weight now. But not the kind of weight Ryan was used to. Not the kind built on family money, football trophies, or networking handshakes. This weight was deeper, heavier, the kind that made people too scared to even say it out loud. Ryan couldn't take it. He needed to be sure. Needed someone, anyone, to tell him it was just gossip, just noise. He needed denial. A student walked past. Ryan didn't know his name, never cared to. But right now the kid was his only hope. Ryan grabbed his shoulder, his voice dropping low, wrapped in panic, disguised as intimidation. Maro, Lou Maro. The boy froze, his face drained of color, like someone had just sucked the air from his lungs. His eyes widened, not from pain, but from fear. He didn't answer, just swallowed, lips pressed tight as if battling whether to speak or bolt. But Ryan didn't need to hear anything else. That silence, that hesitation, it was the final verdict. His heartbeat slammed against his ribs, loud, violent, like a judge hammering down the lid of a coffin. He let the kid go, took a shaky step back like someone realizing too late they'd just walked out onto thin ice. No words. He couldn't find any. In his head, the name Lou Morrow rang out like church bells at midnight. Each time it echoed, another layer of Ryan's confidence collapsed. Lou Morrow, the name his father once mentioned during a late-night call. Voice suddenly quieter than usual. Ryan had never seen his father, usually so commanding, so certain, speak with such hesitation. Now he understood why. He hadn't just messed with the wrong person. He had touched the wrong bloodline. No fists, no threats. Jamal Moreau didn't need to lift a finger because fear had already made its way to Ryan, like a sentence already written, waiting for its moment to be delivered. And now, no matter how far he ran, Ryan Carter couldn't escape the truth. He'd stepped into a world where the rules weren't his anymore. Ryan Carter stood in the middle of Westwood's familiar hallway, the same hallway that had once been his stage, the same walls that had echoed his smug laughter, the same stairs that once followed him like he was a legend. Now that all of it dissolved into a fog thick with truth. Ulimaro, that name was no longer some distant whisper in Ryan's memory. It was real, heavy, like a silent storm rolling in from the horizon, and no one could outrun it. He remembered that night, hearing his father, the man Ryan had always seen as untouchable, change his tone when he mentioned that name. His voice had dropped, just a bit. The authority vanished. A long pause hung in the air. And even as a teenager, Ryan had felt it. His father knew fear, and now Ryan, completely unaware, had provoked the blood of that man. It was like walking straight into a red-zoned territory the underworld had marked long ago, places no one sane would dare step. Suddenly, everything from the past week came rushing back, the shoulder checks, the taunts, the tray flipping. Every act now reassembled itself. Not as schoolyard bullying, but as Exhibit A in the trial of a fool. No way, Ryan whispered. But even his own voice had no weight anymore. It sounded like breath escaping from someone already halfway into the fall. The more he denied it, the clearer it became. The way Jamal never reacted, never snapped, never pleaded. Not because he was scared, but because he knew he didn't have to. For people like Jamal, fear doesn't come from a punch. It comes from silence, from the way a wolf doesn't have to howl for the entire forest to go still. Ryan felt cold, a bone-deep chill slipping through his thick jacket. The crowd around him kept laughing, talking, moving like always, but to him the sound had been dialed down, distant, warped, like the world itself was pulling away, leaving him standing alone in a hollowed-out space. His hand slid into his coat pocket. Fingers touched something small and familiar. A card, pressed with silver-embossed letters. Play with fire. Don't be surprised if you get burned. No signature, No threats, no blood, no blade, just one sentence. A cold needle driving straight into his mind. Ryan swallowed hard, throat dry, his hand clenched instinctively, shaking. No one said a word to him, yet people began avoiding his eyes. No one stood close to Ryan anymore, not because they feared him, but because they feared what was coming for him. A student stood directly in front of him, someone who used to idolize Ryan, mimic his walk, his swagger. Now, the kid wouldn't even meet his gaze. His eyes dropped, a half step back, like standing near Ryan was standing next to a live grenade. For the first time in his life, Ryan wasn't the center of attention. He was the eye of the storm, and the storm wasn't his. He turned, walking like someone waking up from a nightmare they still couldn't name. But the farther he walked, the bigger the fear grew. He didn't know where he was going. Only that one thing burned in his chest. He had to get out, right now. No class, no conversations, no return. Every step felt like he was running from himself. But it didn't matter. No matter how far he ran, Jamal was still there, living in people's stares, echoing in the hallway whispers, living inside the silence of a school, waiting for something to happen. Brian used to think he was playing a power game. Now he knew he never got to choose the rules. He couldn't remember how the next few classes passed. The words on the board were just smudges of ink. The teachers' voices sounded like static from an old radio, muffled, distant, meaningless. The scrape of chairs, the tap of pens, the occasional laugh, they all came through like sounds warped behind fogged-up glass. Far away, emotionless. In Ryan's head, one thought looped over and over, stuck like a broken record, missed with the wrong person. The card in his coat pocket was still there, like something alive. No one else could see it, but Ryan felt it throbbing with each heartbeat, like a coal burning quietly in his chest. It felt warmer now, like at any second it could burst into flame and burn everything down. The looks in the hallway had changed too. No admiration, no respect, no shoulder pats. No one laughed when he walked by. Ryan Carter, once the king of this school, was now something else entirely. A threat to be avoided. A story no one wanted to be part of, and no one said a word. That silence was the most terrifying thing of all. The bell rang. Ryan stepped out the front doors of the school like someone shedding 100-pound weight from his chest, desperate just to breathe in open air. But the moment his feet hit the pavement, something crawled down his spine. Something wasn't right. Everything seemed normal on the surface, students gathering in groups, engines starting, parents waiting in cars. But within the crowd, there were two unfamiliar faces. They weren't wearing school uniforms, no backpacks, not parents, not talking to anyone, just standing there, a few steps from the gate, quiet, still, like props in a scene. But Ryan knew they weren't here by accident. They were sharply dressed, fitted shirts, slacks creased perfectly, polished leather shoes. Everything crisp, precise, and intentional. They weren't security. They weren't cops. They didn't need to introduce themselves. Ryan felt it, and feeling it was enough to make his heart slow in his chest. One of them turned and looked directly at him. A steady gaze, calm, unthreatening, unhurried, but cold enough to make Ryan draw in a breath. Then the man smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, and it wasn't the kind that invites conversation. It was just a gesture, like the period at the end of a sentence. Mr. Morrow would like a word. The voice was deep, steady, no rush, no drag. It didn't need to be loud, didn't need to be sharp. It was delivered like any ordinary sentence, but carried the weight of a truth you couldn't negotiate with. This wasn't a request. It was an order. Ryan froze. He could scream, he could run, he could make a scene right there in front of the school, call for security, yell for a teacher. But he didn't, because deep in the quietest part of his instincts, Ryan knew none of that mattered anymore. He wasn't the golden student, wasn't the son of a powerful man in the city, wasn't the untouchable Ryan Carter. Right now, he was just a kid who had woken something up that should have never been named. The shadow was coming, silent, precise. No knife in hand, yet still enough to send Ryan's whole world teetering, and he knew this meeting wasn't for talking. It was for listening. He swallowed hard, throat dry like he'd just choked on burning sand. That old feeling of control, the one that used to fill him with smug confidence, was now just a hollow shell. He wasn't giving orders anymore. He was the one being summoned. Ryan couldn't even remember when he'd started walking. Everything around him was lost in a thick gray fog. There were still voices, car engines, teachers walking out of the building like any other day, but to Ryan it was all just background noise, like he was drifting away from his own life. They led him to the staff parking lot behind the school, a place students rarely went, no distractions, no witnesses. And there, standing beside a sleek black car, polished to a mirror shine, was the person waiting for him. No introduction, no business card. Ryan knew instantly. Jamal Mara. He leaned casually against the car, hands in his coat pockets, eyes calm and steady, like this was just a casual chat between two acquaintances. No anger, no threat, not a trace of vengeance on his face. That was what made Ryan afraid, because the ones who want revenge usually lose control, but the ones who are fully in control don't need to do anything at all. Ryan stood frozen. He couldn't step forward. His fists clenched on their own, but there was no strength left in them. He knew his role in this story was over. He wasn't the lead anymore, just a footnote tacked on at the bottom of a much bigger lesson. Jamal slowly lifted his head. His eyes, sharp as a blade, sliced through the last fragile layers of confidence Ryan had left. And in that moment, Ryan realized something that stopped his heart cold. From the very beginning, Jamal had never been the prey. He was the predator. Waiting, calculating, patient. And the real prey was Ryan Carter. Everything that had happened, the way Jamal never struck back, the calm silence, the quiet walk through the taunts, wasn't weakness, it was mastery, because Jamal understood something no one else at Westwood did. The real battle doesn't start with a punch. It starts with restraint, with a stare so still, so cold, it makes your own fear unravel you from the inside. Ryan used to think he was king of Westwood, the leader, the one everyone followed. Now he was just a boy, facing something no textbook had ever prepared him for. And he knew, without question, from this moment on, there was no turning back now. Ryan had always toyed with the edge, cheating on tests, stirring trouble after football practice. Every move made just to prove to himself that he had nothing to fear. He believed he was untouchable, the one who controlled the room, the guy others stepped aside for the moment he walked in. But now, in the empty backlot of the school, where the only sound was the echo of footsteps on hard blacktop, those illusions burned to ash. No one was holding Ryan down, no one laid a hand on him, but he couldn't move, because what pinned him in place wasn't force. It was truth. The truth that he'd crossed the wrong person. Jamal didn't need to say his name, didn't need a warning, just stood there, like a figure pulled straight out of some dark fable. His eyes weren't blazing with rage, nor sunken with revenge. They were just cold. Steel sharp, sharpened so finely they didn't need to cut. Just being looked at was enough to make you feel like you were already bleeding. You thought I was weak. The question floated down like a feather. Light, but it struck Ryan like a hammer to the chest. There was no right answer here. Yes or no. Either one would collapse him completely, because this wasn't a conversation. This was a test of character, of understanding, of power. Jamal took one step forward, just one, but it felt like all the air between them vanished. Ryan stood frozen, his shoulders flinching on instinct, as Jamal leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. I don't need to touch you, Ryan, but if I wanted to, your life would never look the same again. No yelling, no fists, Just a sentence, like a verdict handed down without a courtroom. Ryan felt the back of his shirt soaked through. Sweat? Fear? He couldn't tell anymore. Jamel wasn't just the son of Lou Merrill. He was the living inheritance of power. Power that didn't need to shout, didn't need a street gang, didn't need anyone chanting his name. He said little, but every word cut clean, and his silence, more than threat, felt like judgment. Ryan used to think he understood the world, the jungle. Only the strong survive. And now he realized there was a deeper level, one where the rules weren't written down, where only the truly dangerous were even allowed to understand them. And Jamel was one of them. From the kid he used to mock for being quiet, Ryan now stood paralyzed in front of someone he'd once labeled easy to break. No one tied him down, but he couldn't move, because his freedom now belonged to the very person he once underestimated. And deep down, Ryan knew the scariest thing wasn't being hurt, it was being erased. Literally, Ryan Carter stood in the school's back lot, the same place where he once laughed loudest, pulled pranks, strutted with swagger. Now it was a battlefield after the war, silent, empty, bone cold. In front of him, Jamal Moreau turned and walked away. No glance back, no final warning. And yet it was that silence that crushed Ryan's chest. No violence, no threats, no proof needed. And for a guy who ruled the school with clenched fists and smirking stares, that was the death blow. The two men who had brought Ryan here were still standing at the gate, young, expressionless, never looked at him again. But it was their stillness that made Ryan feel like the whole world was collapsing around him. Quietly, mercilessly, he was used to making things happen. If something didn't go his way, he'd force it. If someone said no, he'd push harder. If someone stood tall, he'd crush them. But this time, the power had slipped through his fingers, and he hadn't even seen it coming. Ryan didn't know how long he stood there. Couldn't remember when his legs finally moved. Each step felt heavy, like he was dragging the corpse of his former self across the pavement. That old version of him, arrogant, blind, bloated with false invincibility. He walked back through the courtyard where other students were still laughing, still sharing glances, still living in their carefree little worlds. But for Ryan, it all felt like another reality. Light, sealed off. In his hand, the card was still there, perfectly intact. But it now felt like a brand burned into his palm. 4 short words. Play with fire, get burned. A sentence not shouted, but one that carried the weight of an empire buried just beneath the surface. Ryan used to think power was about noise, being about trophies, locker room cheers, crowds at your back between every class. But today, Ryan finally understood a bitter, simple truth. Real power doesn't have to shout. It only takes a glance, a name, and silence at the right moment. As he stepped into the parking lot, the golden haze of late afternoon cast a cold tint over everything. He wasn't Ryan Carter from yesterday. He was someone running, not from Jamal, but from himself. And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Ryan Carter silently admitted, bitterly, wordlessly, he had never truly been powerful. He was just someone who'd been allowed to be loud until the real presence entered the room. The parking lot was unnervingly quiet. His black Mustang sat there, gleaming like a sleeping beast. He walked toward it and unlocked his phone, a nervous reflex. He didn't know if he meant to call someone, text someone, or just cling to some illusion of control as panic swelled in his chest. But the screen didn't give him that. A new message from an unknown number. 3 short words, no emojis, no name. But the moment he read them, it felt like the breath had been yanked straight from his lungs. Tell your father to be careful at work. Accidents happen. In an instant, Ryan's world froze. He read it again and again, praying he'd misread it, hoping it was some twisted joke. But the words didn't change. They just sat there, quiet, unblinking, like a shadow waiting in the place he least expected. His family, his hands shook as he tried to put the phone away, but every movement was clumsy, shaky. He wanted to delete the message, pretend it had never existed. But the more he tried to forget, the deeper those words carved themselves into his mind, like a blade etching warning into bone. This wasn't some empty threat. This wasn't high school tough talk from some wannabe thug. This was a truth, delivered quietly, and that's what made it so terrifying. Ryan had never pictured his father, a powerful man used to negotiating in boardrooms and shaking hands with the city's elite, as someone who could ever be a target. But now, for the first time, he understood what helplessness really meant. It wasn't the fear of getting hit. It was the fear of losing what mattered most, while being completely unable to stop it. This wasn't about schoolyard bullying anymore. This was a collision between two worlds. One was the fake empire of high school power, where Ryan had once believed he ruled. The other was the deep, quiet dark, where names like Marrow were spoken only with trembling respect. And Jamal never needed to yell, never had to lay a hand on anyone. All it took was a message, a single gesture, and Ryan cracked from the inside out. He stood there, eyes locked on that text. The wind picked up and the sky dimmed into a cooler hue. The sun was still shining, but to Ryan everything had already slipped into shadow. And he knew this wasn't the end. It was the welcome message to a game he never should have entered. In the brief moment standing beside his Mustang, Ryan Carter realized he was no longer the powerful teenager who once strutted through the halls with his chin held high. He touched the screen, not to call someone, but as if to make sure this nightmare was real. The message was still there. Oh, simple, like a bedtime lullaby that froze your heartbeat. Tell your father to be careful, accidents can happen. In one sentence, no exclamation mark, no bolded font, no need for shouting. And it was that calm delivery that made Ryan understand this wasn't a teen drama anymore. It was a warning from a world he'd never understood, never dared enter. He swallowed hard, his stomach twisted into knots, sweat beaded along the back of his neck. He couldn't tell his father, not because he feared being punished, but because saying it out loud would mean admitting the truth. He'd done something that couldn't be undone, opened a door that now placed his entire family at the edge of something dangerous. The days that followed looked the same from the outside. School didn't change. The bells still rang. Laughter still echoed in the halls. The field still pulsed with cleats and shouting coaches. But to Ryan, it was all muted, like someone had turned the volume down on life. Distant. He still wore his varsity jacket, still walked those same hallways. But nobody noticed anymore. The handshakes, the backslaps, the knowing grins, they vanished. All that was left were side glances and empty spaces where his crowd used to be. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Ryan was no longer Ryan. He didn't know why it hurt so much, especially since Jamal never laid a finger on him, never cursed him out, never broke a single rule. But maybe that's why it hurt, because Jamal didn't have to do anything for Ryan's world to completely collapse. It started changing not because he wanted to, but because fear changes people without asking. Whenever he saw Jamal from a distance, he turned and walked the other way. In class, he sat in the back, eyes on his books, but mind blank. His old friends were still around, but none of them had the nerve to ask, "Are you okay?" Because they all knew Ryan wasn't okay, and worse, Ryan wasn't Ryan anymore. No one said it, but everyone felt it. He was living in fear, not the fear of violence, but the fear of someone who once thought himself untouchable, now realizing he was prey, and never knowing when the claws would finally come down. Every night, Ryan woke with a jolt, not from screaming, not from blood-soaked nightmares, but from a voice whispering in his head, soft as wind. "I don't need to touch you, but if I wanted to, your life would never be the same." That voice never shouted, never roared, and yet it gripped Ryan's heart in the dark, squeezing harder with each sleepless night. He began to lose the line between reality and fear. A text message, a passing shadow at the end of the hall, a glance too long. Everything felt like a lit match hovering over gasoline, and the question kept circling through Ryan's mind like a curse. If I don't stop, what happens next? There was only one thing he knew for certain. Jamal didn't need to do anything else, because from the moment Ryan dared to step into Jamal Mauro's world, the cards had already been turned face up. Ryan sat there for what felt like hours, not knowing how long the sun had been setting behind the trees. He used to walk these hallways after school surrounded by laughter and high fives. Now all he heard was wind brushing past his ears and the heavy stone of guilt resting in his chest. He thought about his father, a man who once stood like a monument in his life, and for the first time, Ryan understood. His father could be wealthy. He could be powerful, but he couldn't protect his son from the dumbest mistake he'd ever made, because some lessons can't be bought with influence, and some people should never be spoken down to, not even in passing. Since that day in the parking lot, Jamal hadn't spoken a single word to Ryan. That was the real blade, because Ryan knew if Jamal had wanted to destroy him, it would have been over already. But Jamal, he didn't take revenge. He didn't shove Ryan down or parade his fear. He let him live and watch himself fall apart. Deep inside, Ryan understood if there was anything left to salvage, it was the chance to make something right. One weekend afternoon, Ryan arrived at the football field early, to try not to reclaim his captain spot. He just stood there staring at the sun-soaked turf, like a memory slowly fading. In his hand, a notebook, something he'd filled during countless sleepless nights. Not to explain, not to beg, just say what needed to be said. He left the notebook on Jamal's desk that Monday morning. No note, no name, but he knew Jamal would understand. Inside, Ryan wrote about the fear no one could see, what it felt like to drown while breathing, what it meant to realize he had never been strong. Only a scared kid hiding behind the mask of someone who forced others down to avoid facing his own weakness. And at the end of the notebook, he wrote, "I don't expect forgiveness, but if I ever see someone else getting bullied and I have the guts to do it, I'll stand up, not for reputation, but because now I know what it feels like to be alone, to be broken. Thank you for not finishing me. Thank you for letting me see who I really was." That afternoon after school, Ryan saw Jamal from across the courtyard, his back straight, his pace calm. But this time, when their eyes met for a split second, Michelle gave a slight nod. Just a nod, no words. But for Ryan, it was the beginning of release. That evening, the parking lot was so quiet it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Jamal stood by Ryan's car, leaning casually against it, hands in his coat pockets, head tilted slightly, eyes still as water. There was no threat in his posture, no wasted movement, but his presence, calm, restrained, unapologetically composed, carried the weight of 100 unspoken warnings. Ryan froze. His heart tumbled out of his chest. He didn't know why Jamal was here after everything, not to settle a score, not to reopen the wound. With Jamal's presence, silent, firm, was the harshest reminder yet, I'm still here, and you still don't fully understand the cost. Jamal didn't speak right away. He looked at Ryan for a long moment, and then finally his voice broke the silence. Soft, more like a message than a conversation. I don't need you to fear me. I just need you to understand every action comes with a price. No shouting, no threats, just truth, raw and irreversible. Then he turned and walked away. No glance back, and Ryan was left standing in the fading light, his heartbeat louder than his footstep, a silent sinner with no more places to hide. The following week, Jamal didn't show up to school. No one knew why. No one dared ask, but his absence felt like a final punctuation mark on the story. And strangely, Ryan started to change. He wasn't the arrogant, untouchable Ryan Carter anymore. He sat quietly in class, paid attention, even raised his hand when teachers needed help. One day he saw a younger student being pushed around by a group of upperclassmen. He didn't yell, he didn't fight. He simply walked up, stood between them, and said, "That's enough. Don't do it again." His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm, and for the first time Ryan didn't speak to be seen. He spoke because he understood. Sometimes the only way to make things right is to stop someone else from repeating the mistake you once made. Years later, people still whispered about the Jamal story in the halls of Westwood. No one really knew the full details. All they knew was that after that fall, Ryan Carter was never the same. In Jamal Marrow, he vanished like a quiet breeze, leaving behind a silence that stretched on, not a threat, a warning, because in a world where reputations are too often built on fear, the one who chooses silence is usually the one with the most power.